Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to focus on one of the big international stories we've been watching develop over the last several months out of Iran. And I want to give us sort of an overview of why we're even talking about protests in Iran. And it all started about 2 months ago. You may recognize this woman, Masa Amini. Her face has now been all over the world. It was back in September that something happened where she was brought into government custody. I see something happen because at the beginning of this story, it was our understanding that there was a dress code violation, that perhaps she wasn't wearing her head covering correctly or not at all, but it was a little bit vague. And she was detained by government forces in Iran. In Iran, you are required as a woman to wear a head covering. This is part of the theocracy, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. So she was detained, and it was in government custody that she died. She's 22 years old. And this ignited a reaction all over the world. But as you'll hear from our guest, looking at this story as just happening in the last 2 months probably isn't the most correct way to view it. And that's why we have to talk a little bit more about this. We are marking 2 months since the death of Masa, and protests that have continued all around the country in Iran, in all different communities over the last several weeks. We've been watching to see, would there be a let up? Would there be a pause? Would the violence from the government stop the protesters? And from what we can see from the outside, and that is limited, we admit, because there's no freedom of press in Iran. In fact, the internet has been shut down at times. We're really relying on viral video and people risking their lives to tell us what's happening inside the country. We're at an inflection point where we wonder what's next. And it seems like the appropriate moment to say these protests have gone on consistently for the last 2 months. We're marking the death of this young woman again. And what's really next for this really important country in the Middle East? There's a couple things to consider here as well. As we're watching the protests, we're also watching several stories where Iran is a part of, including what's happening in Ukraine. You might recall in Ukraine, we've talked about Iranian drones being used by the Russians, these suicide drones that are crashing into buildings and causing a lot of death and destruction and fear. There's a connection there that we want to explore a little bit more. We're hearing from Iran that they're developing more sophisticated weapons like hypersonic missiles, for example. We're hearing of more threats against the United States positions or military footprints in the Middle East, and Saudi positions as well. And there's just definitely a ratcheting up of rhetoric coming from the supreme leader of Iran about how the US is to blame for everything that's happening inside the country, not the country's own policy. So there's a lot to unpack here. And over the last 24 hours, this even added more urgency to our conversation that those who have been arrested, and we're just using estimates, we have perhaps thousands of people that have been arrested for participating in these protests. Hundreds have been killed, according to the best information that we have available. We just heard from the judiciary system in Iran, essentially, that one of the first sentences have been handed down to one of the protesters. And without getting more specifics, which we don't have, this person was sentenced to be executed, the death penalty for being involved in all of this, which leads to another question. Is that what's going to happen to the thousands of others that have apparently been arrested related to this inside the country? So we have to talk more about this, and I'm excited to have our guest with us. We've been able to speak a little bit during this time, and now you get to see him in the light of day, which is always nice. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a think tank in Washington, D.C. that I've worked with for years, really respect, nonpartisan. And he has an expertise in Iran and nonproliferation in general, which is key to this conversation as well. He's testified in front of Congress, so lawmakers that are making decisions at the highest level have listened to him, and now we get to listen to him today. So, Behnam, it's great to have you. I really appreciate it. We have a lot to talk to about just regarding this story in general. And the number one question I've received from our audience in Smarter News over the course of the last several months, but really over the last 24 hours, with this announcement of an execution of a protester. Again, we don't have specifics. We're waiting for those. We're wondering if this sets precedent. Is this real? Is the Iranian government actually going to execute protesters? What do you think?
Well, Jenna, it's an excellent question. First, let me just say it's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me on your show. again, big fan of you on any size screen. So, really proud of the relationship between FTD and you in any journalistic capacity. And apologies to the viewers if indeed they do have to see me in the full light. So,
No, it's good with all
just
the
that's
books in the
another.
background. It's good. It's quite impressive. If you've read all of them, we're impressed, Benham.
Yeah, I'm willing to bore you guys with it as well, but that could perhaps be another show. But I think I think a little bit more of a somber, sadder point is in fact what you mentioned. Is this real? And again, many have not known how to make sense of the stuff coming out of Iran because, ironically, there are stories of Meta, the parent company for Instagram and Facebook and whatnot, actually censoring protest videos rather than the people who somehow remain on social media spewing hatred and invective and incitement and things like that. We can get into all of it, but essentially, is what you mentioned real? Unfortunately, it is real because the regime has had no compunction over its 43-year history in being willing to shed blood, and particularly shed innocent blood, and fabricate stories about why that blood was shed. Sometimes it's done it privately, sometimes it's done it publicly, sometimes it's done it with the cover of its, we like to call it the injustice system rather than the judicial system inside the Islamic Republic. It's actually always had this coercive repressive apparatus as part of its cocktail of how it has stayed in power for 43 years. Because as long as there's been an Islamic Republic for 43 years, there's been some variation of protest against the Islamic Republic. And let us just go back to a different iteration of protest in November 2019, when we didn't, again, similarly have a full accounting of how many people had died, and there were just dribs and drabs of stories, plus what external nonprofit human rights organizations were able to make sense of between people on the ground and people reported missing and people reported killed. In December of 2019, it was finally reported that 1,500 people were brutally killed, not in the prisons, but just simply shot at, killed on the streets, repressed in different iterations of national street protests around that country. Right now, the estimate number is somewhere between 330 and 350, depending on whose open source estimate you look at. But pivoting to prisons, where there is a reported 14,000 to 15,000 political prisoners, people who have participated in these protests and have been arrested. The fact that the regime, is trying to met out this punishment tells you one thing: that they fear, more street protests if they went en masse and tried to kill them, because, as we know, the regime has no compunction about doing such killing en masse. For instance, the current president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, when he was 29 years old, he had a position in Iran's, again, injustice system, and he signed off on several death warrants. He was literally part of a death committee. So he kind of moved the paperwork along for 4,000 to 5,000 or upwards of 5,000 political prisoners in Tehran to be killed based on a few fatwas from the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini. So again, this regime has no compunction about spilling blood. It's done it in the past. It's likely to continue doing it in the present. What we see now with these incremental reports and stories of maybe one or two is that the regime is trying to see where the population is and where Western resolve is to hold its feet to the fire. At the home front with population, it's trying to see if more killing will trigger more protests or spook or scare away the protests. And then abroad, it's trying to hope to avoid international censure and sanctions and probation due to what's been going on at home. And again, as you know, just recently, there have been new UK and EU human rights sanctions on Iran. So the regime is trying to skirt all of this with this kind of very murky, graduated, incremental repression of the protests,
So what you're saying is that there's precedent for this. There's precedent for
unfortunately.
both the protests and executions. Um, the question here is, do these protests really pose a significant threat to the existence of this regime?
This is an excellent question, and I think it can be best answered in the behavior of the government of the Islamic Republic. Again, as we know, there's been many iterations of protest in the past, but what we saw starting in Tehran, in Iran, I should say, actually, because it's a national phenomenon. But what we saw starting in Iran in 2017 to present is qualitatively different than the previous rounds of protests some of your viewers may be familiar with, like 1999, the student protest, or more familiar, 2009, the Green Movement, the stolen election. What we saw from 2017 to present is the failure of the reform movement leading up to 2017, the decades of many successful strikes against the government of the Islamic Republic, the overpromise and underdelivery of the JCPOA, plus many more political generations the urban and rural poor coming to the fore and not even seeing the political promise of the Islamic Republic fail, but the economic and social promise of that fail. And the population en masse moved away from reform and towards revolution against the entire system, not supporting one side against the other, but they've been seeking wholesale regime change in Iran in every iteration of national protest from 2017. And while in the West, unfortunately, some journalists have called some of these protests food price protests or economic protests or subsidy protests or headscarf protests or environmental protests, they're misreading the trigger of the protest for the larger reason people come out onto the street and stay on the street, which is that the people don't want the government of the Islamic Republic to be their government. These are fundamentally outside in, geographically, demographically, different protests, and we should respect that. We should understand that a population as diverse as Iran's population has been seeing events in their country and been seeing it despite their different background and despite their different, political and religious and ethnic affiliation and orientation, seeing it with the same light. And so fundamentally, you could say what began in 2017 continued in 2018, 2019, 2020, and even in 2022. There were previous iterations of protests there. And in particular, when people saw the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who was visiting Tehran and allegedly had violated either the headscarf code, or later on there were stories saying her pants were too tight, that the ridiculous social gender apartheid imposed norms that the government, does with brute force with this thing that it calls the morality police. They basically go around investigating people's clothing, and when they want to, they fine, beat, imprison people. And the whole population saw what happened. And moments after her death, there were protests outside the hospital. There were protests right in her funeral. So the hospital was in Tehran, the nation's capital and urban center. Her funeral was held in Saqqez in the western province of Iranian Kurdistan, obviously a much smaller town, different ethnic makeup, but still protests there. And then like wildfire spread through over 140 different cities, all of Iran's 31 different provinces. And 2 months in, the population continues to turn out onto the streets because they are using every single available opportunity, including the brutal death and killing of Mahsa Amini, as well as the larger, discriminatory dressing norms that exist for women, as a larger vector to say we are done with this government. Because the government behaves in XYZ way, because it does what it does, we are done with it. And the regime sees that as fundamentally anti-regime protests. Hence the different things we've seen, the killings, the incarcerations, the torture, the forced confessions, and even scarily since 2019, the regional and the national internet blackouts. So unfortunately, while many in the West misread these protests, they're saying, oh, it's only a women's protest, or it's only a social protest, or past protests when they were flooding, they said, oh, it's only an environmental protest. No, these are nationwide political anti-regime protests. And when you look at the fear of the government of the Islamic Republic and their massive crackdown and the things they've done to stay in power, we don't need to take it from some Western journalists who are not following the story. We should take it from their mouth, from inside Iran, looking at what the regime is fearing, because they know that since 2017, people have been turning out because they are entirely done with this system.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because we have some direct quotes coming from the Ayatollah that I want to share with our audience as well, so that we use a primary source when we're talking about Iran, not just have a theoretical conversation. But just going back to what you just said, it sounds like what you're saying as to what we're witnessing in Iran right now is both completely about Mahsa Amini and then has nothing to do with her at all. It's a little bit of a juxtaposition of the two things. Can you describe that more? Because when we spoke a couple weeks ago, and I reached out to Behnam a couple weeks ago to talk about the relationship between Iran and Russia, which we'll hopefully get to a little bit here as well. That was one of the most surprising things from our conversation, is a real realization that I shouldn't focus on this as a chapter that began in September, that I had to have both a broader view and a specific view of the event. Can you describe that to us?
I think you hit the nail right on the head there. It is both general and particular. So, in the sense that everything we've seen from 2017 to present in the longer history of 43 years of protest against the Islamic Republic, 2017 to present is an entirely new chapter. It's the done with reform, and we're going to have revolution against this system come hell or high water. These are different iterations of these protests. And the ones that, the Mahsa Amini ones did not oh, they weren't the only ones that happened in 2022. For instance, in May 2022, there was a similar national uprising, began in different cities, and the trigger was not the killing of a young Iranian Kurdish woman. The trigger was, again, food subsidies. But we shouldn't be, falling for the trigger only. We should be looking at the larger things the Iranian population says in their statements when they come out onto the street. Since 2018, for instance, one of the things they've been saying, and it's busted totally one of the major myths that have long existed, is, the Iranian people have been protesting, saying, I'll say it in Persian first because it rhymes, which is "Doshmanama haminjas durugh migan Amrikast," which is to say, our enemies here, they lie when they say it's in America. And this is unprecedented because people thought in the past if you would put foreign pressure on Iran, you would deter street protests. And in fact, if you had ongoing street protests, foreign pressure would, basically move the people toward the government. And nothing has been further from the truth. This myth that existed that kept former President Obama hostage during the 2009 Green Movement, that if you say something, it's going to be the kiss of death, that is qualitatively not the case. And we've seen that in these different iterations of protests. You see all of this in their slogans and in their chants. And so while what happened to Mahsa Amini was brutal, and while what happened to her was seen the same way by Iran's, again, demographically, geographically, socially, ethnically, culturally diverse population, that population was also tapped into this larger context, but is, again, willing to use every available opportunity to make that older claim and re-up it every single time.
How did you become an expert on Iran?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a personal and professional passion. I try not to use the word expert because that suggests that it's something that you're kind of done with. Expertise, if you graciously do use that term with me, it is something that you constantly have to refine. You constantly have to be checking, reading these primary sources. So every single day, I'm looking at the Persian language press, what's left of the reformist press, the ultra hardline press, the state press, the semi-official press. Even though I don't have social media, scouring the open feeds on certain social media applications to see what the national and international conversations are like, where there is linkage between the analysts and the activists, or diaspora and dissidents. And again, here I've been, living and working in Washington for about 15, 16 years now, I think. And I've been honored to have 10 years of it with FDD. And during those 10 years, I could say I have all the scars from the pre-deal, during deal, post-deal, and now potentially back into the deal iterations of all the fights in Washington, which unfortunately was not about the facts on the ground inside Iran, was not about these street movements, but was about this 800-pound gorilla in the room, which I'm happy to address later, which is deal or no deal, nukes or no nukes, sanctions versus centrifuges. It was the stuff that oriented and animated a lot of our policymakers here, and I was privileged to partake in many of those debates. And one thing leads to another, right place, right time. I'm a first generation American. I'm an Iranian American. So, this story has been part of my story growing up. I always knew the Iran of, my family and my ancestors. My mother's side fled after the revolution. My dad was, out already before. But long story short, I felt like it was in my DNA, and I wanted to own part of that story. And so, yes, there's a lot of great Iran history and literature and whatever books behind me, but there's also a fair amount of political stuff as well. There's also some cooking, and you have to have a little bit of balance in life. Some
Well,
novels, some cooking,
that's
some
good.
poetry.
Some diversity and all of it. I think one of the big headlines coming from your answer there was that you don't have social media, which is like shocking. For anyone for anyone working in Washington D.C., is there a reason for that professionally? Is it just
To
something you
be
just personally don't
brutally
want?
honest,
Yes.
I find it to be a little bit of a cesspool,
Well,
particularly living and working in Washington, and not to use that word very lightly.
it's
And
okay.
the other thing is that the self promotion bit is not my forte. I love to do things the old fashioned way. It is a privilege to meet members of Congress, congressional staff, embassy people, think tankers, reporters, both domestic and foreign, over coffee or over lunch. I still cold call. I still do emails. I'm always very receptive, on WhatsApp and things that people send me. So I try to make myself as available as possible without touching that final third
Well,
rail. So
I'm
it's just
impressed.
more of a personal guardrail for me than anything else.
I'm impressed. I don't think that's an inaccurate description, although I also think social media can be used for good as well, which
Oh,
is our connection,
absolutely. Yeah.
obviously our connection on Smarter News. And also, I mean, this is where you really do see, as you mentioned, the what's the right word? It's this catch 22 about social media, which is, yes, you can get sucked into what could be a pretend world. You don't even know if these people that you're talking to are real necessarily. And at the same time, and censorship and all the issues that come with the technology companies. And then at the same time, man, I've been so grateful for social media for so many different reasons in my career. One is primary sources. I don't speak Persian. I don't speak Farsi. There's no way for me to understand what exactly the Ayatollah is saying, but his translation in English is on Twitter. And so therefore I have some access point to it. So it is. And we were able to get protest video and understanding of what's happening on the ground in Iran with an asterisk that we can't confirm it. So it is. I'm very curious about that. Thank you for
It, it it's a critical part. Sorry to interrupt, by the way. It's a critical part of the national conversation, but I figure you might like this quote. I think it's from Christopher Hitchens. I don't know if he was paraphrasing someone else or he was saying it, but he was saying it in relation to alcohol, and I think it matters here for social media, which is, I think he was paraphrasing someone. I have to double check, but he said it's an excellent servant, a horrible master. So if
yeah.
you can do this, you can exploit the open sources. You can look at what's being said. You can, see the conversation among the nation and among the nations and among different people. It is possible to track all of that live and for free and without an account on Twitter. You just have to do it manually, and it takes more time. I don't have a ghost account or anything. That's just not my style. But it is possible to do that at various different levels of your own engagement. But I think
Yes.
excellent servant, horrible master. So make it work for you. Find what you need.
Is definitely a good tip. I'm going to share some of the Ayatollah's tweets in a second. Before I get to that, I'm curious, just your family background. The Iran that I know as an adult, which it isn't at all because I can't go visit. I'm not. There's no access for me. I mean, I could try. It'd be a little bit risky. That's a whole other conversation. Um, what what was the Iran of your parents' youth like? Because we to understand the Iran now, we sort of need to understand what Iran was like in the past and how this transition happened to the current government that is now ruling Iran? That's a big question. It could be the source of a documentary that could be 4 or
Oh, yeah.
5 or 10 hours long. If you could give it to us in a couple minutes, that would be great. But maybe with some of your parents' perspective, I mean, what did they tell you about growing up in Iran? What was it like? And then what was the transition like that we should understand?
So it was a qualitatively different kind of country. And in fact, it looks like it's two different kinds of countries. You know, um, Iranians take great pride in their culture and their history. And there's something that me and several others in Washington have been saying, whether they're opposition folks, dissident folks, diaspora folks, analyst folks, Iranian Americans, first generation, second generation. I've been lucky to hear this, and I've been privileged to say this, which is that when people use the word regime, like it's a pejorative word, and Iranian is a positive word, I never like to use the word Iranian regime because there's nothing Iranian about this regime.
Mhm.
If Iranian is a good thing and regime is a bad thing, let's not have this odious third world kleptocratic oil-based Islamist authoritarian regime, which has taken the Iranian nation and all this stuff hostage for 43 years. Let's not give them the honor of that honorific of that epithet of Iranian, because they are not the inheritors of this great culture and civilization and language and literature and poetry. In fact, they're the sworn adversaries of it. They're the sworn adversaries of nationalism. They're the sworn adversaries of the tons of different iterations of poetry that have made the Persian language what it is. They're sworn adversaries of Iran's magnanimous pre-Islamic past. That is the identity card of many Iranians. I was actually just recently in London on a work trip and ended the work trip briefly in the British Museum, where they have the Cyrus cylinder, where Cyrus the Great, who's mentioned in the Bible and is basically the kind of the founder of the Persian Empire 2,500 years ago. He had this cylinder, talking about respecting different religions when he conquered Babylon, not through violence, but just kind of welcomed as a liberator. Probably not many people welcomed as a liberator in Iraq these days, but 2,500 years ago, he essentially was. And you saw different iterations of Iranians, old people, young people, children, grandparents, looking at this thing, convening on basically what is their national identity card, what this little clay rounded tablet that gives their ancestry meaning. So for me and my parents, I heard qualitatively of a different Iran. Pre 1979 Iran, just by way of a small anecdote, was essentially, you know, day and night different from what you have now. In terms of women's dressing norms, in terms of social freedoms, in terms of economic freedoms. Obviously, part of the issue was that there weren't commensurate political freedoms. But it was a massive, obviously, economic behemoth. There was social and economic change. There was booming. There was development. It was largely pro-Western. Different iterations of American presidents had met with the then king, now late king of Iran, who is now the last Shah of Iran. Um, but it was just basically day and night that the US and Iran actually had a good relationship, that the Iranian passport on the world stage actually meant something. You wouldn't be discriminated against in a customs and border patrol thing around the world. My father was living in Europe since the mid to late 60s, if I'm not mistaken. He would talk about how the Italians would get more discrimination over the border between Italy and Switzerland than he would, with his, Iranian passport. It was just a qualitatively different kind of world. When you look at the Iranian currency, for instance, the rial, or the subunit, the toman, now you just have to add a bunch of zeros because it's becoming worthless, if not already worthless. But the national currency was relatively strong then. Now the regime is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. Previously, it was a pillar of international stability and order, and played a key role in the Western post-World War II security architecture. It's a day and night difference. And just to bring it really home, in different little family get-togethers and parties, across the Northeast, just growing up, you saw a different Iran in the newspaper and in the press. And growing up with stories about terrorism and hostage taking, and illicit financial stuff, and then obviously since 2002 to present, all the nuclear drama. But at home and in different iterations of other people's homes, friends, family, whatnot, relatives, distant people, closer people, it was a qualitatively different game. That these things that oriented and animated the very narrow factional hardline government of Iran were simply not at all things that mattered. And in fact, the religious discrimination that you see in Iran simply did not exist in the society. This
Hmm.
obsession with wiping Israel off the map simply is nowhere to be found
So what
among
changed?
any element. It's just
Then
that it was taken over in 1979, built off of a 77, 78, 79. There were massive street protests in Iran, macroeconomic contraction, a whole series of anti-Shah protesters basically log rolled themselves into a big coalition. And at that time, there was the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had led protests in the past, in the 60s. He was living in exile, first in Iraq and then ultimately in France. And many kind of looked to this older religious figure, some very naively, to be this kind of Gandhi figure. And he swept in with a kind of a cabal of ultra hardline Islamists, but some nationalists, some liberals, and many, many leftists, and then spent the first decade of the 1980s, when he came in, doing the things that have made and sustained the Islamic Republic a threat it is today, turning people against each other, exile, imprisonment, mass arrest, an 8-year war with Iraq, 2-year that was defensive, 6-year that was offensive, international hostage taking, resuming the nuclear program, procuring ballistic missiles, such that today the regime is home to the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. The drone program also starts at that time. Iran's threats to maritime shipping and energy also begins in the 1980s. And then constantly using every foreign crisis to narrow the domestic political spectrum, so that what you have today is a massive chasm between the state, which is revolutionary, authoritarian, and Islamist, and the society, which is post-revolutionary, not Islamist, but secular nationalist. And in terms of what they want, they're not authoritarian. They're seeking representative government, potentially democracy. So this now cocktail cannot hold. And it was brought about by this revolution and the foreign and security policy behavior of this regime, coupled with the domestic suppression of every iteration of protest every time they tried to contract the system, and they have over the past 43 years.
But what you're saying is so important for us to understand. If it was mass protests that brought in the current regime, and really interesting point there about saying Iranian regime, it's going to make me think about my word choice in the future. So I really appreciate that. If protests have been such a key part in the changeover of government, we get even more of an understanding as to why these protests both matter and why they're also a threat to those currently in power, because there's been a precedent set for it, as we've discussed. Let me just show folks what I was just on Twitter I check in with the Ayatollah regularly. I don't think he checks in with me, but I check in with him and see what he's talking about. And one of the things that has come up in recent weeks, and it happened fairly quickly after the death of Massa, and there were protests that came into the street. It was instantly the Iranian government started to blame the United States and to blame the West and say this isn't actually Iranians that are doing this. This is being fomented from the outside. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like, here's one tweet from previous last few weeks, beginning of November, actually just probably about a week ago. And this is the U.S. Decline is obvious. And the Ayatollah is saying the signs of the U.S.'s decline are obvious. They have economic, social, and moral problems inside the U.S. There are discords and bloody divisions. Ironic that he's using those terms to describe America. These are their domestic problems, and these are the miscalculations in global affairs. Here's something a little bit more recent after that, just to give you an idea again of the sort of language that's coming out of Iran. This also coming from the Ayatollah. The current world order is changing, and a new order will prevail, which will have three main elements: the isolation of the U.S., a transfer of political, economic, cultural, and scientific power from the West to Asia, and an expansion of the resistance front in its battle against aggression. This is all part of a repeated drumbeat of the United States, the West. They're losing power. They're trying to foment discord here at home, and they're going to lose. There's something different coming. Can you give us some perspective as to why? Why is the Ayatollah blaming the United States? Is that effective? What should we know
Well,
about this?
this is, I think again, you hit the nail on the head here, because this is a tried and true tactic for this regime. Just to pick up on where we left off, because they know how they came into power with massive street protests plus strikes, which we can talk about because now there's some strikes in Iran that we should keep our eye on. And if you're on the side of the people, obviously you want those strikes to be expanded and sustained over time, because street power plus strike power is essentially the ingredient that helped push out the previous regime in the past. And if they're married together, which is popular power and economic power, can be sustained against the regime, it'll put the regime in a box so that time one, time two, time three, there's less resources for their political and economic elite to basically have. And then they're going to be more inclined to be making mistakes. And that gives the leverage over from the state onto the street. So definitely keep your eye not just on the streets, but on the strikes, because that was that cocktail that helped bring about that older revolution. But I think pivoting to the Ayatollah's tweet thread, this is a tried and true playbook. Whenever they're weak at home, they blame a foreign actor or a foreign adversary for any kind of internal divisions, totally not being cognizant that they themselves are the ones responsible for this massive chasm between state and society that currently exists in Iran today.
And
After
let me just
43 years of government, it's their fault. It's
let
what
me
they've done.
and let me just jump in there for a second. Is there any evidence that the United States is involved in any way on the ground in Iran, helping to foment these protests? Do we even have a presence there? And I mean, it's hard to talk about intelligence sources, but is there anything to fully explore this? Is there anything to his accusation?
I mean, not only is there not anything to his accusation, but for those of us who see Iran and the plight of the Iranian people, and the potential that could come if one day you do have a representative national government inside Iran, that would be one of the few places in the Middle East that the West, and particularly America, can have an alignment between its head and its heart. Seldom in national security, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, do you get to marry your interests and your values. Usually those two things, and in particular in the Middle East, are like this. They're never like this. I think standing with the Iranian people and supporting them in their larger quest for representative government actually would be good for our head and good for our heart, good for our brain, and good for our national security, and good for our values. But ultimately, here you've seen Washington, even really since 2009, be exceptionally hesitant in even remotely being seen as supporting the protesters. That a lot of that changed with the Trump administration. There was tougher rhetoric, there was tougher sanctions, there was talk of finding ways to have telecommunications transfers. I think the most publicly the U.S. has done is to try to provide VPN so that Iranians can get around the national intranet or the national internet that the regime has tried to put to hollow out Iran and make sure that the people can't access outside information, and that they can only access regime approved websites and servers and things of that nature. So no, this is a tried and true tactic that, to blame someone else for why the Iranian people are protesting, to not see what is happening in your own society. These are guys who have drank their own Kool-Aid. They partially see that the society is qualitatively different than them, but they can't bring themselves to understand that they are the ones who pushed people into this direction. And that ultimately, because they have this very kind of ultra hardline, narrow, Khomeiniist interpretation of 12er Shiite Islam at the front of their brains, they filter everything through that. And everything is zero sum, everything is a cosmological battle. And there's no room for any kind of gray in this. And so they see themselves on the side of right. And the gross things that they have done, which is rape in prisons, mass incarcerations, the killing of minors. There's tons of younger Iranians that have died, like juniors, like people under the age of 18, people under the age of 16. They've done these unspeakable things, and all just to save this regime. So I think, really we have to push away from the table when the Ayatollah does this, because this is something that they've long done. They've deployed it in different iterations of national protest. And my qualm is that there is actually more that we can do. We should not be afraid to stand with the Iranian people. We should not be afraid to help them with telecommunications support. We should not be afraid to systematically name, shame, designate, punish, sanction, visa ban the entire chain, from the national politics to the local level commanders, of people who are engaging in this gross repression, and to make sure that them and their families don't have an exit ramp or like a parachute to live in Canada, America, Europe, and the West after they've done this gross repression.
Do we have that leverage, Behnam? I mean, do we have that opportunity to do what you're saying without having diplomatic relations, and knowing that Iran is a lot of Iranian families, there's very little connection, especially with the government, with the United States. At least that's my impression. Maybe I'm wrong. Do we have the leverage to do what you're saying?
I think not only we have the leverage, but it's the right time, and also we have the requisite political and legal authorities. These tools exist. So just recently, again, I was in Europe, in Brussels and Berlin for some meetings. It's no secret. The company that hosted me even tweeted it out. So this stuff does exist on social media. This is not some cabal, but ultimately talking about the fact that there are shared authorities on both sides of the Atlantic. So if there are the shared tools for this, we should share the targets as well. Both sides of the Atlantic should be talking to each other about, well, there's a protest in this province of this town. Who is the IRGC commander in charge of repressing the protests in this province and this town? Which one of you guys has the relevant authority to name, shame, designate, punish, visa ban, sanction these guys and their families who are
Hmm.
engaging in this systematic repression? Because, by the way, those entities, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that does the domestic suppression, they also do the foreign aggression. And just recently, this is the second time since these protests have gone on, and the third time since in the whole year of 2022, when the IRGC has fired ballistic missiles in a foreign public military operation. And they fired them at Kurdish positions in northern Iraq. So they're trying to project strength abroad when they know they are weak at home. So not only do we have these authorities, we simply should be acting on it. For instance, the commander of the base that has fired these missiles, he fired them in September. And actually, for the first time ever in the US-Iran relationship, uh, a Iranian ballistic missile killed a US citizen in northern Iraq. And the response of the State Department was just to kind of condemn it, and also to mention that that individual is a dual national. He's an Iraqi citizen. This is atrocious. This is the kind of stuff that lowers the bar for the regime's use of force. So whether you're looking at this from the human rights perspective, whether you're looking at this from the strategy perspective, again, we are lucky that our heads and our hearts can be in the right place on this issue. So there is more we can do. There is more we should do. There is more that we can absolutely do together across the Atlantic. And there is more that we can do with the rest of our partners and allies, because when there is a will, there is a way.
Well, why haven't we done it yet?
This ridiculous obsession, and I hate to hammer this point, but I think we should, embrace this truth that so long as this 800-pound gorilla in the room continues to handcuff and handicap the quality and content of our Iran thinking. And this 800-pound gorilla is the 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So long as this is still on the table, we're not going to be able to materially pivot to a qualitatively different kind of pressure strategy to be able to walk and chew gum and have our heads and our hearts on the right place on Iran. Because ultimately, what this deal would do is that it would enrich the worst of the worst actors, like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, like the Supreme Leader of Iran's office, like the whole network of parastatal institutions and faux private sector that feeds off of the people there. So essentially, if we get this nuclear deal, not only are we not kicking the nuclear can down the road, I'd be happy to bore you and your audience to death with why, not only was this a bad deal by 2015 standards, but when you're looking at the Iranian nuclear program in 2022, and you're supposed to give more money and get less in return, sometimes statecraft, you can't have it all. Sometimes you can't have a perfect solution, and sometimes you do need to kick the can down the road. But this is like standing in a short hallway and kicking the can down the road and not realizing in less than 2 years' time that can is going to be atomic and coming back and barreling at you.
Okay, but
Uh,
hold on a second. So President Trump, though, he's the one that during his administration is no deal, right? The Obama administration has the deal. Trump administration says we don't like that deal. We're going to step out of it. Then you have the Biden administration re-engaging again on the deal in some capacity. Although that would be a great question for you to find out, kind of like what's going on at this very moment with it. Even during the Trump administration, if the end goal is to have Iran not a state sponsor of terror, to not be targeting US bases, to not be terrorizing its own people, to actually be a potential partner someday, as unbelievable as that sounds, but it was at one time. So go back to that. That wasn't achieved simply by exiting the deal, right? We still didn't get the end result that we wanted. So do we need just like a completely different approach? We're not seeing if the end result is to not have Iran to be a threat, and both Democrats and Republicans haven't been able to achieve that in 20 years, then what are the new ideas that we should be entertaining to get us there? Because clearly we're not moving in that direction unless you're seeing something different than some of these broad generalizations I'm saying, Madam.
Well, sometimes in life, it's not always about the answer, it's about the question. And I think Republicans and Democrats need to have a shared understanding of the Iran threat. And most unfortunately, today they don't. Republicans are dogmatically against the nuclear deal. Democrats are, broadly speaking, are dogmatically for the nuclear deal. So our own partisan politics is part of what is handicapping us and
Mm.
preventing us from moving away from this issue and being able to look at the facts on the ground that we're missing, the new regional facts that are missing, and how this is becoming transnational quite fast. There are Iranian drones being used in Ethiopia. There are Iranian drones in Venezuela. There are Iranian drones now, as the people of Ukraine fear and have felt, in Ukraine, in the hands of Russia. I'm glad we're all alive today to see Iran, which after the 1980s emerged and tried to rebuild its military after the Iran-Iraq War and was so reliant on Russia to do so. Now Iran is the one arming and equipping Russia to do what it's been doing in Ukraine, allowing it to stay in the fight longer. So this is a qualitatively different kind of actor, and it does require exactly what you're saying, which is the creative solutions. But so long as we fight each other, it's not the
Mm.
Democrats who win, it's not the Republicans who win, it's the Ayatollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps who win.
So why can't we get
And
over that? Well, I mean, at this point, there's been a lot of debate about it. What's holding everybody up from seeing something clearly
it,
together as a threat against the United States, but so many parts of the world?
a lot of it has to do with threshold for risk and time horizon. And with respect, when you talked about the Obama, Biden, Trump period, foreign policy and the threats that our adversaries face, they don't neatly correlate with the start and end of an administration. We need to have continuity. And there has been a bit of a rupture, not just a rupture with, obviously President Trump leaving the deal, but a rupture in how we've approached Iran. Because once they sense that there are these changes in our national conversation about Iran, they will exploit that. For instance, the most
Mm.
significant nuclear escalation, if let's pretend you don't care about the regional situation, most unfortunately, and let's pretend you don't care about the domestic situation, most unfortunately, let's pretend you only have the nuclear blinders on, that your goal is just no nuke and then pivot away from everything else. The deal not only doesn't get that, but the most significant nuclear escalation to date happened while the Biden administration was elected in November 2020 up until present. And the Biden administration campaigned on getting back into the deal. And actually, when it was in government from January to April, it talked about getting a longer and stronger deal. And then when negotiations indirectly began in April 2021 up until present, not only have our pulled punches and the sanctions that we inherited, which we chose not to enforce, to tempt the Ayatollahs to come back into compliance with that fatally flawed deal, not only has that not worked, but the Iranians have pocketed concession after concession from us and from the Europeans over the past year and a half, and irreversibly grown their nuclear knowledge base. They have done things that they threatened to do a decade ago, but only feel comfortable doing today. And I think they read us right. And most unfortunately, a broken clock can be right twice a day. We simply shouldn't be in the business of allowing that number to change, because we should make sure that, well, if a broken clock is right twice a day, it's wrong 22 times a day. So step one, no self-inflicted wounds. We need a shared picture of the threat between Democrats and Republicans and everybody else here. And then we need to socialize that shared understanding of the threat with our partners who have traditionally been even softer than us, and our partners across the Atlantic and around the world. And now you're beginning to see that with a little bit, because the knife of the Islamic Republic has burst out of the Middle East. For too long, many people ignored the Arabs and the Israelis who said, oh, the missile threat, the drone threat, the nuclear threat, the terrorism threat. Many people ignored that. But now, with Iranian advisors in Ukraine providing this lethal support to the Russians, that has burst out, and that has gotten Europe eagerly focused on trying to find a way to disrupt the sale, supply, transfer of these drones, as well as potentially the ballistic missiles, which would be a military game changer. There are reports that the missiles that Iran has used against all these different positions, including US bases and other facilities across the Middle East, that those missiles would go to Russia. Those are Iran's most precise, single stage, solid fuel, short range ballistic missiles that are road mobile. The Middle East has felt the temper of that for quite some time. It may soon go to the Russians, and the Russians may use that, which is a cheaper weapon. And if our tool against the Russians is more air defenses to the Ukrainians, plus more sanctions against the Russians, well, these cheaper Iranian weapons are designed to overwhelm those defenses, and are also designed to allow the Russians to stay in the fight longer, as we're trying to get them to end the fight quicker with our sanctions. So
What is
this is a global threat.
Well, I mean, that gives us a lot of perspective, right? Because suddenly it feels different if you have Iranian weapons in Europe, if you're a European. You think, well, wait a minute. I thought that was sort of in the Middle East. That was something that was being dealt with in that part of the world, not necessarily something in my backyard. What is behind that partnership between Russia and Iran? Why would Iran want to send any of its resources to Russia at this point?
It's also an excellent question, because here in Washington, the conventional wisdom, based also something on a historical understanding, is that Iran and Russia actually don't like each other. If you look at the past half millennia of Russian-Iranian interactions, actually no country has done more damage to Iran and taken away more territory from Iran than Russia, in the imperial czarist, in the Soviet Union, and in the Russian Federation form. Even under the Russian Federation, there's been drama between Tehran and Moscow. But ultimately, Putin and Khamenei are part of this larger club of autocrats now that increasingly see coordination as key to their survival. And this is the same, of course, for the Kim regime in Pyongyang in North Korea, and the third term Xi Jinping and the CCP at the helm in Beijing in China. This is basically, I don't want to take the words out of the former Bush administration's mouth here, but this is basically the new axis of evil. And we should look back to the way these alliances worked during World War II. Meiji Japan and Nazi Germany were very different ideological political systems, but increasingly these two circles moved to become a Venn diagram. And then when they declare war on us, and when they're killing Americans, it matters not, because they're essentially functioning as the same circle. And Iran and Russia may have this historical enmity, but the overwhelming interest to basically do death by 1,000 cuts against the West. All of these states believe that the regional balance of power in all of their neighborhoods are artificial, and that they're supported and imposed by the West. So they're looking to subvert the regional balance, and they're all looking to subvert this larger, post-World War II Western and American-led liberal world order. And they're doing it with this death by 1,000 cuts approach, trying to evict America from some regions, trying to start new proxy wars in other regions. And they do see in America, and unfortunately a Western bloc that has traditionally been more timid. And that's a very dangerous proposition, because the more risk averse we are becoming, the more risk tolerant they are becoming. Potentially the situation in Ukraine stands to change that in the minds of some folks. But again, these are resolute ideologues, and they share that larger geostrategic interest. And there's tactical reasons why the Iranians may want to do it too, because they never paid a price for their drone and missile stuff in the Middle East, because they proliferate it and they have someone else engage in these operations, and they insulate their own territory from reprisal, but they also learn about how well these systems work. And you can learn about how well they work against different air defenses if you send it over there.
Interesting, and it's such a contrast to see that those that we would call adversaries, despite all of their differences, seem to be navigating common ground at an exact time when you're saying, "Hey, we need to get on the same page, even within America, to
Oh
make
yeah.
sure that we're assessing Iran in the right way." Just over the last week, actually, it was the same day that I was sharing the tweets from the Ayatollah. It was on November 3rd. President Biden, he was in a campaign event, so it's before the midterms, and he's talking to a crowd. And basically, there were some protesters that were in the area, and as he was speaking, they were also talking about uh, the issue of Iran. And he said this, and it wasn't good enough sound for me to pull, so I'm just going to just tell you what the quote was. He said, "Don't worry, we're going to free Iran. They're going to free themselves pretty soon." What do you think of that assessment by the president? What is the solution here, Benham?
You know, to read that through the prism of international politics would mean that the U.S. is going to become more interventionist in Iran. Decidedly, that does not seem to be the case. To read it through the U.S. domestic politics, and again, I'm not I'm not an expert in U.S. domestic politics. It's yet another gaffe by the Biden administration because I think they came out after and they tried to pour water on it. You know, when people talk about regime change, and I hate to use that loaded word, but people always picture 2003 Iraq, and they forget about the kind of the moral and the strategic and the political convergence of us supporting oppressed peoples in a jurisdiction that is run by a major adversary. They forget about the experience of the Cold War, is essentially what I'm saying. And they forget about the successes of the Reagan administration in standing up for the people who lived in the Soviet Union who were oppressed and standing up against the government of the Soviet Union. So there's lots of examples from history that we can draw on that need not make us look like anything at all like 2003. And no one in Iran is calling for that either. But they are calling for us to put our money where our mouth is on this issue. So if the president said that, then let's see where U.S.-Iran policy does go. But the major test, in my view, is if we close the door on this JCPOA business, on this 2015 nuclear deal business, because that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a nuclear policy, but it means that our nuclear policy should be a subset of our Iran policy. We can't have our Iran policy subset to this deal and no deal hyper-partisan business, because so long as that happens, it's the Ayatollahs that are going to win.
Interesting. So you think that really is the juggernaut from anything from this point on, how we engage,
Watch the
that's
deal,
that's
exactly.
part of the
Because
paradigm.
if it's on the back burner, the Ayatollahs will know that we're not serious. And there's a great political scientist, Tom Schelling, who I think was quoted later by Mark Trachtenberg. I forget who said this, but talking about ornamental and instrumental. So there's been actually quite a bit of sanctions by the Biden administration since September, and that's actually very good. But the problem is, just like the European ones, are these part of a larger and concerted strategy, or is this political cover for deal reentry? And so long as the deal is on the table, we won't really know. And if you take the deal off the table, you can link this with greater integrated air and missile defense, and greater export control, advice and support to European jurisdictions where Iran is going shopping for these drone parts, for instance, because it does have a lot of Western parts in the supply chain
Mm.
of these drones and unmanned aerial vehicles. We have to admit that. So if we are going to get qualitatively tough with the government of the Islamic Republic, step one is do no harm. Do not enrich those who are doing the domestic repression and the foreign aggression. And so that means pushing away from the deal and connecting the dots between our sanctions and export controls rather than disconnecting and pushing away.
Well, the people, and it just because they're not here to represent themselves, I'm just going to generalize those that are really in support of the nuclear deal say this is how we have to engage in Iran. We have to be able to talk to them. We're going to be able to negotiate our way out of this conundrum, which is we don't want a key state sponsor of terrorism with nuclear capabilities, not only for their own government, but to give to terrorist groups around the world or their friends. Like we don't want that. So the one way we're gonna engage, and that's how we're gonna fix this. There are those that don't agree with that, but it seems this is important, Ben. And you're not saying that we don't talk to Iran. It's just that you don't think that this deal should be part of our conversation. Do I have that correct?
Partially. So I would say, well, right now you should not be talking to Iran, period, because even politically sitting down next to a regime that is spilling blood in Ukraine, spilling the blood of its own population, and continuing to export the revolution throughout the Middle East, politically, morally, strategically, that would be a self-inflicted wound. And step one, no self-inflicted wounds. Ultimately, you can have coercive diplomacy. You can have, sanctions and potentially engagement if you're looking for a much bigger, broader, better nuclear deal, which was something actually the Biden administration said it was seeking between January and April. But as soon as indirect negotiations began in April, they used that as a political cover and never mentioned longer and stronger ever again. Um, but I think ultimately, right now, we need to move to close the door on this deal. And if there is a diplomatic opportunity, we should explore it. But let's not jump at it, because taking stock of what happened on the streets in Iran, yes, the US should have every option on the table, but let's take stock of the new facts on the ground. The new facts on the ground tell you that whatever deal you get is going to be on shaky foundation,
Hmm.
that the chasm between state and society is growing, and that any deal would have sanctions relief. And do you want to be in a position of, whether on the nuclear file alone, or potentially if you get that bigger, broader, better deal that is not just nuclear but non-nuclear, would you actually trade away those penalties? Under what conditions would you trade away those penalties? So empirically, I would actually say no, withhold diplomacy altogether right now. Conceptually, always be open to diplomacy if it's coercive and if you can get what you want. But this is not something that we should be kind of dangling in front of the Islamic Republic right now, because that's how they're testing us. That if we're too afraid to close the door on this, and in particular this deal, then we don't have, for lack of a better word, a plan B in store. And there have been Democrats, while President Trump was in office, who have talked about the need for a plan B. And there have been Republicans, while President Biden has been in office, to talk about the need for a plan B. Let's get these people together and come up with a mutually shared plan B, and really close the door on this and begin a new chapter. Because let's remember one thing, that the deal itself doesn't actually prevent a nuclear Iran, a nuclear Islamic Republic. It actually just delays it briefly, and now we're actually getting closer and closer. And potentially by 2025 to 2030, any remaining restrictions would come off, and there would be no physical legal impediment for Iran to be ramping up these capabilities. I'm old enough to remember 2020, for instance, when the Trump administration tried to unilaterally extend a UN arms embargo that used to be permanent, but it was subject to, when the nuclear deal came about, was subject to a 5-year period, so 2015 to 2020. In ultimately, 1 or 2 months before the before the arms embargo expired, the Trump administration tried to extend it, and the U.S. was laughed at by its partners who were for trying to extend it. Ultimately, if you had a functioning arms embargo in place that was vigorously enforced, maybe you could impede Iran's exports of arms to Russia. So these things that have looked political in the moment, they ultimately look like, from 50,000 feet, a bunch of self-inflicted wounds.
Hmm.
And for those people who say, well, it was because Trump, left the deal in 2018. The Iranian nuclear threat did not begin on May 8, 2018. We need to broaden the aperture and understand what we're dealing with, which is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism is going to do whatever it takes to try to get a nuclear weapon. The question is, turn it over to policymakers. What are we going to do? What is our timeline? What is our threshold for risk? And what is our assessment of our adversaries' intentions and capability at time one, time two, and time three? And we need to have that national conversation. It can't just be deal or no deal.
Well, and you wonder if you could have that national conversation if we could just show the American people the tweets from the Ayatollah. If you just share that with the public, what would be public sentiment? Because public sentiment is something that politicians depend upon and in their own political survival and their own strategies. And you wonder how that, could be a factor in all of this. Is there's more attention, more young people are really curious about what is happening in Iran, what's going there. And let's just going on there. Let's just take this full circle as we wrap up here, Behnam. I understand what you're saying, which is you can't sit down and talk and further legitimize a government that's murdering its own people. And that is, we're seeing that in the streets of Iran. Despite not being able to confirm everything, that's what we're seeing. People are getting murdered for protesting the government. They're being imprisoned for infractions that we would not even consider here in the United States. And it's almost difficult for us to imagine at times that this is what's actually taking place. What happens next here? We got the first sentence for an execution. Do you think the Iranian regime is going to just execute hundreds, thousands of people in the aftermath of this protest? Do the protests continue? We've gone 60 days. What do you think the next 30 or 60 look like?
I think it is going to be about, and I'll paint a picture that's easy to remember with alliteration, four S's. streets, strikes, sanctions, and security forces. And we kind of mentioned this before, but street power needs to be sustained if there is going to be some kind of fundamental change inside that country. To help amplify the power of the street, you need to go into strike mode. And you are looking right now at least three different parts of Iranian society, three different parts of Iran's economy, I should say, the energy sector, which is critical, as well as higher education, as well as parts of the service sector, have been striking in different kind of shorter term bursts. If those strikes are sustained and are particularly more widespread across the energy sector, not just oil, but petrochemical, which is a key way the regime has been surviving under these loosely, laxly, if ever, enforced sanctions that the Biden administration inherited, then you would put money and time back on the population side. And then you would have these two domestic sources of pressure against the regime. And then if we complement those domestic sources of pressure against the regime with foreign pressure and foreign sanctions and united transatlantic sanctions, stuff like we saw the Europeans do recently, that we can marry and amplify as well as enforce the penalties that we have inherited, you could have a pincer against this regime rather than let the regime try to exploit one against the other. And during these periods of times is when you see security forces actually decide wherein their political and life survival is. So maybe at time one, time two, they might shoot, but time three, time four, they might not. And so you want to break the resolve of the security forces. And part of this is to be done by telling them they have a future in a different system.
Hmm.
That ultimately the most odious ones who are giving out these commands will not. But the rank and file and some people who have been conscripted into this kind of stuff, that they potentially might. That is obviously something for the Iranian people to figure out under any kind of model like the South Africa or Brazil, Argentina. They've had various truth and reconciliation commissions after the collapse of a autocratic regime. But ultimately, that's what to look for. You want to look for more street power, and if they go into strikes, and if those strikes are widespread, then you want to look abroad how we do on the sanctions front. Are we barely there? Are we amplifying what we have? And then you want to keep your eye on the very kind of stratified security forces. Are they still shooting? Where do they feel most comfortable? Are there cities where it's kind of divided? The population rules the city at night, the regime rules the city at the day. Are there cities that are fully in the hands of the Iranian protesters? Are there more cities kind of falling or not falling? So keeping your eyes on these four will tell you where things are headed, success or failure. But I think God forbid if these protests end tomorrow, you could still call it a success because you've had the Iranian people showing that they're not afraid, even though they are losing life and limb every time they turn out to protest. And when you look at the gaps in the protest history, 1999 to 2009 was a decade. 2009 to 2017 was almost a decade. But 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, there is a rapid pace. This should tell us something, that the good guys are winning and that ultimately the Iranian people don't want to settle for less. So there will be another, to borrow a phrase. There will be more, regardless of the way this thing shakes out. And so, through social media or through other ways, let's take our cue from what's going on inside Iran rather than some people who are filtering it through their Washington or other kind of lenses.
Wow, that gives us a lot to think about and sets us up for our next conversation. This one's already gone longer than I promised Behnam, and I apologize about that, but it
Well, I
always we
apologize.
got to no, we got to get it's a lot of topic to unpack. I'm glad we were able to spend some time together. That next question would be, well, who if the current government goes, who's in its place? And do the Iranian people have an idea of what sort of government they would like to see, as you mentioned? But we'll save that for another time. We're going to watch closely through the next several weeks. What does this look like? And whether or not these executions come to fruition. I say whether or not, even though there's precedent, there's also an appeal process that's been an interesting part of the reporting in all of this, where there's like, oh, well, there's a little bit of daylight. Maybe it won't happen. And as to your point, it's being used as a way to try to figure out, well, how do we stop these protests? And the government there's no stopping it so far based on violence and arrests. So the power of the Iranian people to continue to protest, their resilience has been something that the government can't seem to quell. And it's that race to the bottom, I guess, if you just want to give us your final thoughts, that concerns me most, right? Which is if the current state of violence and the current state of threats haven't done it, how much worse can it get? And it's a scary thought.
It is a very scary thought because, unfortunately, this is the Middle East, which means it can always get worse, not better, or it's always going to be getting worse before it gets better, you could say. It means that the regime still has much more of its repressive apparatus in store. And when you talk ultimately to dissidents, activists, diaspora, inside, outside, people who are talking to the protesters and beyond, one thing you've heard in different iterations of protests is the fear that even if you do get to a point where part of this very layered and lethal security apparatus does not shoot on their neighbors, does not shoot on their fellow compatriots, well, the regime does have a non-Iranian, all-Shiite foreign axis that they call the axis of resistance. Hezbollah, the Afghan Fatimiyun, the Pakistani Zainabiyun, the Iraqi Shia militias, the Syrian Shia militias, they have deployed these in the past on Iranian territory for flood relief and environmental reconstruction. And
Hmm.
those were timed actually with those flood protests of 2018, 2019. Who knows what might happen if they deploy a foreign legion to put down a domestic uprising. So again, there is a lot of room, unfortunately, for concern and worry, which is why when you look at the fact that the protests are continuing, you can only take your hats off to these people for their bravery because they know they're risking life and limb, whether they're getting shot on the street or getting taken to jail.
Absolutely. And it all, our conversation started, as we mentioned, bigger picture, but Masa Amini is the reason why so many are focused now and that the spotlight of the world is still on Iran. And we want to make sure we keep it there, along with all the other things that we're watching, because that matters too. Benim, it's been great to talk to you. I really appreciate it. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for the time. And we really look forward to having you back so we could talk more about this.
Your privilege. Thank you for the time and opportunity. Looking forward to it.